In a major retreat by diversity advocates, venture capital firm Fearless Fund ended a program that awarded grants to Black women-owned small businesses. The Atlanta-based firm made the move to settle a lawsuit with anti-affirmative action and anti-DEI crusader Edward Blum. Speaking on the case, Blum said, quote, race-exclusive programs like the one the Fearless Fund promoted are divisive and illegal. Opening grant programs to all applicants, regardless of their race, is enshrined in our nation's civil rights laws and supported by significant majorities of all Americans. Blum's organization, American Alliance for Equal Rights, filed the lawsuit in August of 2023.
Fast forward to June of this year, and a federal appeals court sided with Blum's stance that the program likely violated a Civil War-era law barring racial discrimination in contracting. The court temporarily enjoined Fearless Fund from closing its application window and awarding the $20,000 grants, finding that doing so would probably discriminate on the basis of race. The Fearless Fund challenge is one of the first following the Supreme Court's decision in June 2023 overturning race-derived admissions at Harvard University and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. This case was seen as a test to feel out how the High Court's logic of race neutrality would play out in the private sector. Opponents of this latest blow to diversity and inclusion see this as an inflection point in the battle for racial equity. So what do you think of this ruling, Jessica? It seems like actually the Fearless Fund decided not to challenge this in court or take it to a higher court, to an appeals court. They went ahead and settled because they were worried about what would happen if this got up to the Supreme Court.
Right. I think, the workaround, speaking of the Supreme Court, would maybe be to give them gifts like are given to Supreme Court justices. Instead of their official capacity as a venture capitalist firm, in their private capacity as just rich guys, individual people, they could just go around Atlanta, visit the small businesses themselves, ask for the owner's card, and contact them directly to give them the grants. If they want to invest in Black-owned small businesses, they have every right to do it. A person cannot be prosecuted. I would like to see them try for making decisions on what businesses they would like to personally invest in. They could simply say, this is just my decision. I know them personally. I'm giving them a gift. So yeah, in an official capacity, I can see them looking at this application process and say you're making, your decision based on race. Therefore, technically it violates the law. The Supreme Court would absolutely rule in favor of that. We've seen how they've handled similar issues before, but I don't think there's any reason why people with a ton of money can't give some of it to Black-owned small businesses.
Yeah, I think that's true. And in this case, it was the organizational structure and the explicit charter to only give grants to Black female-owned businesses that obviously ran into legal trouble because of the Supreme Court's affirmative action decision. And there was a lot of speculation as to whether or not the Supreme Court's decision would expand to other areas of American life. And it turns out that it does, at least so far, what we've seen. The Biden administration has faced pushback on several of its government-run programs as well. For example, they had a program that gave loans to quote-unquote disadvantaged farmers, and they found out that the loans were only going to farmers of color. No white farmers were eligible for the loans, so they ended up suing the Biden administration with the Pacific Legal Foundation and had a pretty big victory on that front. There were a couple of other loan-related programs that came out of the government in the past few years that were overturned because of the Supreme Court precedent and the law against racial discrimination. For me, I'm actually glad to see this. I think we should be moving to a more race-neutral society, but I would imagine, Jess, you probably have a different view on that.
I definitely want to move towards racial equity, racial equality. I think that a part of that has to be some equalization of the distribution of wealth. We see wealth, especially in the South, concentrated in the lands of white descendants of slave owners. A lot of the money made off of slavery has been invested, has grown into more money. The value of the land has appreciated. And so there's some path dependency following the era of slavery that has led to precisely the wealth inequalities we see today across, Black people in the South and white people. And so should there be an allotment for venture capitalists who want to invest in Black-owned small businesses? I think yes, in the interest of repairing race relations post-Civil War in a way that hasn't meaningfully been done in terms of wealth. And so it does feel wrong to attack this kind of program that specifically gives grants to Black women-owned small businesses. And so it's sad to see that this came under attack when there's other racial discrimination happening across the country that could have been Bloom's focus.
I guess it's dependent on whether or not you buy Ibram X. Kendi's proposal that past discrimination can only be rectified with present discrimination. I don't subscribe to that worldview, especially considering the United States is made up of a lot of people who played no role, are not ancestors of, are completely divorced from the nation's history of slavery and civil rights discrimination. I think it's actually wonderful to see that the United States has continued to move and progress beyond that historic sin and that historic blot on its legacy. And the more that we try to enshrine programs that are dedicated to making us not race neutral, but quite the opposite, and enshrine present discrimination, is something that actually brings people to a more prejudiced place. I mean, we've seen the effect of DEI trainings and racial bias trainings in universities, where a study from Harvard found that these programs actually made the problem worse because they put race as such a factor in people's minds that they ended up being more overtly prejudiced unintentionally due to the hyper focus on it. So I just question whether these programs are really the answer when we've seen research suggesting that the more we focus on race, the more it becomes an issue for people.
Yeah, the way I see it is you've got people who have a ton of money because a large part of it was value created off of free labor done by slaves during chattel slavery. They've invested that money, it's grown into more money. They're pretty rich now. A good analogy might be if you're playing cards with someone and then you find out that they've been cheating and they've made a ton of money off of you. You don't say, "Hey, okay, well, just don't cheat anymore," and then deal another hand. You say, "No, give me my money back. Let's start off from square one because it turns out you've been cheating here to make all of this money." You wouldn't keep playing cards with that guy and be like, "You know what? We're going to forget the past because the past was bad and we want to move forward." No, that guy's a cheater and he owes you the money back. That's kind of how I see the economy post-slavery. There's a ton of wealth concentrated in the hands of slave owners and descendants of slave owners. There's got to be some equalization of the resources in the country that were unequally and unfairly distributed. And so we can say in our relations with other people, yes, we see race, but we're not going to discriminate based off of race. That can be different from we have to equalize the playing field that's been offset by things that are unfair, things that are unlawful.
I think you might have a point if we were talking about a very narrowly tailored type of situation where it was people who made their money off of slavery or are descendants of people who made their money off of slavery, and as you describe it, were then able to invest that money and get incredibly wealthy. But the fundamental problem here is that it's not a narrowly targeted program. This is white versus people of color. And I think it's fair to say that the majority of white people in America were not descendants of slave owners, had nothing to do with slavery. A lot of them were immigrants from other places after the institution of slavery was already abolished. So when it's white versus black or white versus Latino or white versus Asian, as opposed to, as you're describing it, people who benefited from slavery versus people who were subject to slavery, that's an entirely different conversation, and it's one that is predicated on solely racial discrimination, as opposed to talking about reparations for people who were suffering versus people who perpetrated that suffering. I just think that it's too generalized, the conversation that we're having in terms of this Fearless Fund and other funds like it. And I'll let you close us out, Jessica.
Yeah, I will say the Supreme Court in the past has ruled that you can deny someone business based off of their identity. You don't have to sell someone a wedding cake if they're gay.
That's
You
not
have
accurate.
to
That's not what the Supreme
give
Court
someone a
ruled.
grant Do you have to give someone a grant because they're white? Maybe not. Maybe they can make decisions on who they give their loans to based off of identity in a similar way. Perhaps they could form a church that says it is our religion that only, black people deserve investment in the South who are the descendants of slaves, and then say it's a freedom of religion thing. I think there's a lot of avenues of ways they could go about continuing to give loans to Black Americans and get creative with the Constitution as it's been interpreted, not as it exists.
Well, you're talking about First Amendment rights versus the movement of money to certain racial groups. And what the Supreme Court ruled in that wedding cake case was not that he doesn't have to serve gay customers, but they were talking about the fact that he has artistic freedom, aka freedom of speech, to not write on a cake with his own hand that he supports a gay marriage. In fact, he offered that gay couple to sell them any cake in the shop. His only qualm was that he would not make them a custom cake that celebrated their gay wedding because that was a violation of his speech rights.
Well, in the same way that Citizens United depends on an interpretation of free speech to give money to political candidates, a venture capitalist firm is a business, and what they're selling is investments. And if certain people believe in their heart of hearts that it's against what they believe in to invest in white-owned businesses in the South, considering the legacy of slavery and how it affects the economy and wealth distribution today, that they don't believe in that, and so they shouldn't have to, and they should be able to pick to invest in Black women-owned businesses. I think you could argue in the same way it is a free speech concern.
And as such, that would actually give them an even greater ability to exercise that right than the cake owner who has been in court for the past 15 years because people keep wanting him to put things on cakes that he disapproves of. We're going to have to leave it there. We'll be back with more Rising after this.